Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Now, what is the value of this middle class so defined and described? First, it has a stake in the country. It has responsibility for homes material, homes human, homes spiritual. The home is the foundation of sanity and sobriety. It is the indispensable condition of continuity. Its health determines the health of society as a whole. And these words were spoken by Robert Menzies in 1942 when he delivered his Forgotten People broadcast. The incredible rise of home ownership during the Menzies era is one of his government's most notable achievements. 2 years before Robert Menzies came to power, in 1947, rates of home ownership in Australia stood at just 53%. By the end of the Menzies prime ministership in 1966, this had increased to 71%. During this period, the size of new homes increased, while the average household decreased slightly. How did Menzies achieve this rapid change, and why did he do it? Joining me to discuss home ownership then and now is one of Australia's best-known economists, Saul Eslake. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Saul.
Delighted to be with you, Georgina. Thank you for asking me.
No, it's great to have you on Afternoon Light all the way from Hobart. I think you're possibly our first Tasmanian guest, so it's very exciting.
Good. Then you've just become a truly national program.
Yes, indeed.
As the AFL will eventually become after many years of falsely claiming that it was.
Yes, well, don't the United States call baseball the World Championships?
Yeah, although actually...
Even though only Japan and the US play it?
And Canada, but actually the reason that's called the World Series is because it was named after a magazine or a newspaper called The World.
Ah, okay. Well, I stand corrected. Thank you. See,
yeah.
On Afternoon Light.
Most people don't know that, but my wife is a New Yorker who told me that when I made many years ago the same observation that you just did. And she explained the background to it.
It's useful background, and I think for our history podcast, it's useful to have that piece of context. So I thought we'd start our discussion by just talking about why home ownership is an important thing, why it is important for an individual, a family. It seems like it's part of the Australian identity to own your own home, and it seems instinctively a good thing, but I think it's important to articulate why it is and maybe why it might not be.
Well, I think a good place to start with that, Georgina, is another excerpt from the speech that Sir Robert Menzies gave in 1942, from which you quoted earlier. Later on in that speech, he said that one of the best instincts in us is that which induces us to have one little piece of earth with a house and a garden which is ours, to which we can withdraw, in which we can be among our friends, into which no stranger may come against our will. And unlike some other things that Menzies is remembered for saying which haven't aged as well, I think that's an aspiration that's still shared by an overwhelming majority of Australians, whatever their political complexion might be. It's probably not as keenly felt by the young as it was in the late 1940s, in part because younger adults don't marry as early or have children as early as they did in the immediate post-war decades. And they typically spend longer in the education system than people did in the late 1940s, 50s and 60s. And they come out of the education system these days, if they've gone on to tertiary education, with significant debts averaging in excess of $22,000 per student these days under the HECS and HELP schemes. But nonetheless, my impression is that by the time people have got to about 30, they are still very strongly interested in becoming homeowners. And if they come to the conclusion that they can't become homeowners anymore in the way that in most cases their parents or grandparents might have done, they tend to be rather miffed about that and feel that they've been deprived of something that they've regarded as maybe not quite an inalienable right in the way that the Americans talk about things, but nonetheless something that was a distinctive part of life in Australia. And in addition to the reasons that Sir Robert Menzies articulated in his speech, there are other important considerations as well. One is that Australia's retirement income system has, as one of its implicit assumptions, that the overwhelming majority of people will own their own homes outright in retirement years, so that their housing costs are pretty low, just council rates and repairs and maintenance, and that the small minority of people who haven't been able to attain home ownership by the time they reach their retirement years will be accommodated in social rental housing where their rents are fixed at a relatively low proportion of their pension. And that's one of the things that's allowed Australia to get away with relatively low spending on pensions compared with many other countries, and hence allowed us to have lower taxes than European countries in particular. But of course, that's diminishingly true. Another important factor has been that, especially in the last 30 or so years, home ownership has been one of the principal means of wealth accumulation for people outside the top, say, 10% who are able to accumulate wealth by owning businesses or investing large amounts of money in shares and other financial investments. But for ordinary Australians, historically, owning your own home, paying off the mortgage before you reach retirement age has been the principal means of accumulating wealth. So in addition to the security that home ownership provides people, the sense of community it gives them, and the sense of security for bringing up children, if that's what you decide to do as part of your life, the things that Menzies articulated some 80 years ago now, it still retains an awful lot of contemporary relevance to a large majority of the Australian people.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I wanted to touch on this sort of idea of wealth creation when it comes to home ownership. Menzies in the 40s was responding to one of the ministers in the Chifley government, John Dedman's concern that the Commonwealth government is concerned to provide adequate and good housing for the workers. He's not concerned with making the workers into little capitalists. Menzies' retort was, actually, we do want to make the workers, the people, individuals, into little capitalists who own their own home. That idea that you do own your own home and you could build some wealth around it was part of the Menzies pitch. But as you said, now owning your own home can be, and owning other homes as well in terms of investment properties, individuals can, without trying too hard, become quite wealthy and sort of significant little capitalists, even quite sort of reasonably big capitalists if they use the taxation advantages wisely or effectively.
Yeah, I think both major parties have moved quite a long way from the ideological division that was encapsulated by that debate that you referred to in the mid-1940s. The Labor Party was, in those days and for some time afterwards, overtly socialist in the objectives that they proclaimed. And of course, the Chifley government tried, among other things, to nationalise the banks and to gain control over prices and incomes, and had already nationalised Qantas and other entities like that, whereas the Liberal Party had at that stage, and still, an overt commitment to private enterprise, although some of the things that they're saying in recent days about wanting to break up supermarkets, whereas the Labor Party's comparing that with a former Soviet Union, suggests that a lot of ideology has flipped in the intervening period. But I think, to be fair, the Labor Party moved very much in the direction of favouring home ownership in the decades after World War II. And while Menzies made some important changes to the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement that he inherited from the Chifley government when he came to office in 1949, in particular, putting a home ownership element into a program that, as originally devised by the Chifley government and by John Dedman, had only been about providing rental housing. Instead, he introduced a home ownership content to it. That was maintained by subsequent Labor governments when they came to office, and Labor governments have, I think, been no less committed to schemes designed to promote home ownership, sometimes in different ways, in the last 25 years or so than Liberal governments have been. So, as in some other areas of economic policy, there's been something of a convergence between the two major parties over housing policy. The other key difference, I think, is that the housing as an investment vehicle was not a priority for Sir Robert Menzies and his immediate successors, I think. And perhaps the best evidence for that is that during his prime ministership and for about a decade afterwards, the ratio of house prices to average incomes was remarkably stable at about 3.5 times. And in his biography of Menzies, John Howard highlights that as one of the successes of his prime ministership, that throughout it, home ownership was something that could be afforded by a single income family. And that was something, as John Howard says, that Menzies was proud of, and I would think rightly so. Whereas in the last 30 years or so, housing has become to be seen, particularly by the conservative side of politics, as much more of an investment vehicle than it would have been seen in Menzies' days or in Malcolm Fraser's time. I mean, I wouldn't normally quote a communist dictator in support of anything, but I think Xi Jinping isn't completely wrong when he says, as he often has, in the Chinese context, that houses should be for living in, not for speculation. And unfortunately, a lot of the decline in housing affordability over the last 60 years or so, really since Menzies' prime ministership ended, but particularly since the early 1990s, has, I think, been a byproduct of the increasing view that housing actually is a vehicle for property speculation, for betting on prices of land, in particular rising at a faster rate than the consumer price index or disposable incomes or the share price index. And while that's obviously been of considerable benefit to those who got their feet on the property market ladder before this trend began, it's been very much to the detriment of those who haven't been so fortunate. And that includes, of course, a significantly growing proportion of people under the age of 45.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. And as you say, it's something that wasn't a feature of that Menzies era. I wondered, Saul, before we can get on to a discussion of how that change came about, we could just touch on why it was that there was this massive increase in home ownership during that Menzies period. You've touched on the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement and Menzies' government shift from the Chifley government approach, very much focused on providing rental accommodation to more encouraging people to build or buy their own homes, and they might buy from the state if it was public housing stock. But what were the mechanics of that? What was going on at the time in terms of policies, but also in terms of population flows into the country? Because I think this is really fascinating.
Well, there are a couple of things that are worth remembering in that context. One is that Australia experienced its most rapid population growth in percentage terms during Menzies' prime ministership. Australia's population in some years grew by more than 3%.
Yeah.
And these are numbers that we haven't seen since then. Some of that was, of course, through the baby boom that almost all Western democracies experienced after the end of World War II. And this was part of the optimism that followed the Allied victory over fascism in the 1940s and a determination to escape the misery of the Great Depression. The generation that fought World War II had to live through and were determined to build something better and different in the post-war era. And part of that optimism was reflected in the baby boom. But also, of course, we had the massive post-war immigration program, which was initiated by the Chifley government, but very much embraced by the Menzies government and its successors. It was another area in which policy converged between the two major parties during that era. And on top of that, we also had a massive inflow to Australia's major capital cities from rural areas that had begun in the 1920s, but was faster during the 50s and 60s than it has ever been since. So there were massive movement from rural towns into Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth in particular, which meant that the populations of Australia's biggest 5 cities also grew much more rapidly than they have done in percentage terms than they have done in the last 25 years. And yet, despite that, the ratio of house prices to average weekly earnings remained remarkably stable at about 3.5 times. And the main reason for that was that government policy in Menzies' era, at both the federal and the state level, and therefore under governments of both political persuasions during that era, was focused on expanding the supply of housing. And apart from presiding over an ambitious immigration program, governments didn't do anything further to inflate the demand for housing. They focused on building more houses. In the 1950s, and that was entirely under Menzies' administration, governments built 1 in every 5 houses that were built. And under the Commonwealth State housing agreements that Menzies tweaked, 30% of those houses built by public authorities were for sale, principally to people who had an income but couldn't qualify for loans from the savings banks or building societies. The Defence Service Home Loans Scheme assisted tens of thousands of people who'd served in the war into home ownership, and not just the Second World War, but the Korean War and later the Vietnam War. And on top of that, state governments and local governments saw it as part of their job to assist the conversion of what was essentially rural land on the fringes of our big cities to be converted into land that was available for the construction of new housing. They didn't impose big upfront charges on developers. Rather, they typically borrowed money in order to fund the provision of suburban infrastructure and expected to service and repay that debt from the rates that were paid by the people who moved into these estates, or if they were maintained by state government authorities, as they often were in many cases, by the rental income that tenants would pay into state governments and the grants that they would get from the federal government. Now, to be sure, much of this housing was poorly located from the perspective of easy access to employment. They were often poorly serviced by the kind of community amenities that we expect to find in new housing estates today. They were particularly miserable places for women with children, while the men, as they almost exclusively were, went off to work. Women had to look after the kids without much access to their own family networks, to grandparents and other relatives who these days are typically brought in to assist with childcare. That wasn't available. And many of the houses were also poorly constructed because they were put up in a hurry. But nonetheless, they gave people that first rung on the property ladder, or they gave them a secure place to rent if they weren't affluent enough to be able to afford to become home buyers. And in only 2 years, between 1947 and 1971, did the supply of housing fail to grow at a faster rate than the demand for it, because the emphasis of government policy at all levels was on boosting the supply of housing rather than boosting the demand for housing over and above what was necessarily entailed in a rapid rate of immigration and the post-war baby boom. And I think that's the key to understanding why the home ownership rate increased so much during Menzies' time and for a short period after that. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Australia's home ownership rate began to decline after the 1966 census, when the focus of government policy began to shift away from boosting supply to, at the federal level, inflating demand, and at the state and local government level shifted away from boosting supply to restraining supply as a result of the growth of what we now call the NIMBY sentiment, that is not in my backyard, or as it reached its apogee under the Carr government in New South Wales between 1995 and 2005, and what was sometimes called banana, that is, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. And so state and local governments in particular have switched from doing whatever they could to boost the supply of housing to doing lots of things that have consciously or unconsciously, deliberately or inadvertently, reduced the supply of housing or made it much more expensive to add to the supply of housing. And I think that combination of federal policy switching away from boosting supply towards inflating demand and state and local government policy switching from boosting supply to restraining it are the main reasons why we are now in the mess regarding housing policy that Australia is.
And why do you think this is, Saul? What was it? Politics, what the public was demanding, that the population...
Ironically, I said before, I don't think it's a coincidence that Australia's home ownership rate peaked at the census of 1966 at about 72%. That was the first census after the introduction of the first homeowners grant scheme, or as it was called in that day, the Home Savings Grant Scheme, which was introduced by the Menzies government in October 1964, having promised it at the 1963 election at the urging of the New South Wales Young Liberals, whose president at the time was one young John Winston Howard. And that was the first step in what became a long-term shift away from policies that focused on boosting the supply of housing to policies that focused intentionally or otherwise had the effect of boosting the demand for housing. This was a scheme that gave people what seems now a relatively small sum. I think it was $800 or £400, something like that. And in order to qualify for it, you had to be married or engaged. You had to have a proven savings record over the previous 2 years. And there was a limit on the value of the house that you could buy with the proceeds. So it was limited in scope, but it was meant to assist people accumulate a deposit and to provide a reward for saving towards the goal of home ownership. But over time, these schemes became progressively more generous in terms of the amount of money they provided, and the criteria for determining who was eligible for them became increasingly loose. And it reached its apogee under the Howard government with the introduction of the GST in 2000, where the Howard government insisted that the states provide grants of $7,000 to first home buyers, irrespective of whether they bought a new home or an established one, supposedly as compensation for the impact of the GST, even though the GST only applied to new houses, not to established ones. And after then, every time it looked as though house prices might be about to fall, the Labor government under Kevin Rudd during the financial crisis and the Morrison government in COVID, and at different intervals between those periods, state governments of both political persuasions would step in with ever bigger grants. And if you combine that with stamp duty concessions to would-be first home buyers that state governments have introduced over the last 25 years, or the various schemes that have been introduced by governments in the last 5 years to allow people to buy homes with less than the traditional 20% deposit, whether they're mortgage deposit guarantee schemes or shared equity schemes, what we now have is 60 years of evidence that shows that anything that allows Australians to pay more for housing than they otherwise would, be it first homeowner grants, stamp duty concessions, lower interest rates, easier lending criteria on the part of banks, mortgage deposit guarantee schemes, shared equity schemes, tax breaks for property investors, anything that allows Australians to pay more for housing than they would be able to without those schemes or events results in more expensive housing, not in a higher proportion of the population owning that housing. I find it hard to think of any other area of government policy where governments of all political persuasions keep doing the same thing, expecting that next time it will be different, which kind of reminds you of Einstein's definition of insanity.
Yeah.
He once said was doing the same thing over and over again and expecting that next time the result will be different. All of the evidence says that giving Australians the means to pay more for housing than they otherwise would may benefit the small minority of people who are able to arrange their fares in order to become eligible for those schemes. But ultimately, the benefits of them end up in the pockets of vendors of existing housing or builders and developers of new housing, which is why I have more than 2 decades referred to first home owner grants as second home vendors grants or builders and property developers profit margin expansion grants, because that's actually where the money ends up. And I have, and you'll have to forgive me for sounding cynical here, but I have often wondered why governments of all political persuasions do that. And I find it hard to get beyond the observation that in any given year, on average, there will be 100,000 Australians who succeed in becoming first home buyers. And let's assume that for every one who does, there are 4 or 5 who don't. So in any given year, there might be 400,000 or 500,000 people who want to buy their first home and who would like governments to do things that restrain the rate of house price inflation. But at any given point in time, there are at least 11 million Australians who own one property There are 20% of Australians now, Australian taxpayers, who own at least one investment property. And the last thing those 11 million Australians, those 11 million voters want any government to do is anything that slows the rate of property price inflation. So on the one hand, 500,000 votes for policies that might actually put a brake on house price inflation, 11 million votes for policies that would put the pedal to the floor on property price inflation. Even the dumbest of our politicians can, as the Americans say, do that math.
Yes.
And they do it. Yeah. They shed crocodile tears in public for the difficulties faced by young home buyers getting their first foot on the property ladder. But when it comes to devising policy, they continue to favour policies that we now have 6 decades of evidence to show not only don't work, but actually make the problem worse.
Yeah, well, as you say, the political realities are on the side of the homeowners, and despite the obvious concern that people have, the plight of young people unable to get into the property market unless they've got wealthy parents or parents who are prepared to sell their house, downsize, and then
this is going to have lasting. That's right. This is going to have lasting consequences. I mean, I said before that it was one of the unstated assumptions of our retirement income system that people will have close to zero housing costs in retirement, and therefore pensions can be lower. I mean, as a result of the very substantial declines in home ownership rates among people under the age of 65. And it's perhaps worth just making a little diversion here to emphasise that although the aggregate home ownership rate has only dropped by about 6 percentage points between 1966 and 2021, according to censuses, the declines among people aged 45 or less have been more than double that. The home ownership rate among people aged between 25 and 35 is now as low as it was in 1947. The home ownership rate among people aged 35 to 44 is as low as it was in 1954. In other words, if you like, all of the achievements that were made during Menzies' time in boosting home ownership rates among those age groups have been completely reversed. The only group among whom home ownership rates have not declined are the over 65s, and they have doubled as a share of the population since 1966. So, in fact, what we're looking at, what is inevitable, is a significantly higher proportion of Australia's population are going to reach retirement age having not paid off their mortgage. They will quite rationally use their superannuation to pay down or off their mortgage, which means they will be dependent on the pension, contradicting the fundamental assumption of superannuation. And there will be a growing proportion of the population who have not achieved home ownership at all during their lifetime, and they will be subject to the vicissitudes of the rental housing market, insecure tenure, propensity to sharp increases in rents when the vacancy rate drops to low levels, as it has done in the last couple of years, and there simply isn't enough social housing around to accommodate that. So that's one thing. The other, I think, disturbing consequence of what's happened is a growing gap in wealth between those who own property and those who don't, which is not so much a gap between the rich and poor in the traditional sense. The gap between rich and poor hasn't widened as much in Australia over the last 20 years as it has in the United States or a lot of other countries. But what has opened up is a much bigger gap between the old and the young than has traditionally been the case. Now, obviously, older people are going to have more wealth than younger people because they've been in the workforce longer and so forth. But that gap is now much wider than it was 25 years ago, let alone in Menzies' time. And most of it is the result of the combination of rising property prices and declining rates of home ownership among people under the age of 45. And eventually, history tells you that widening inequality in this sense, particularly because we're talking about, in the case of young Australians between 25 and 45, people who are well educated and capable of expressing themselves, there could be quite a significant social unrest about this. I mean, the way it seems to be playing out at the moment is that it is drawing young people increasingly to the Greens,
Yes.
who appear to have made a conscious decision to shift their focus away from purely environmental issues now to be advocating on behalf of renters. And they're advocating what I think are some very bad policies like imposition of rent controls that have been shown in lots of other countries to have all sorts of perverse and undesirable consequences. But these are appealing to a growing cohort of younger voters who feel excluded from the things that their parents and grandparents enjoy.
And who feel a sense of hopelessness. So if you give up on the prospect of ever owning your own home, then you are very concerned about policies that relate to secure rental arrangement and how high your rent will go and how long your lease can be and what your rights are when you're leasing a property. So the Greens as a political force have, I think, really cleverly identified that the demographic more inclined to vote for them has a concern around these economic issues, around lack of affordability of housing, but then have basically, as you say, they've given up on the virtue of home ownership and trying to find policies that would actually deliver home ownership for this younger generation and focused on policies that in the end will make it even worse, but will at least satisfy in a sort of populist way some of the concerns that these young people have around their rents going up and they're not being able to stay in a rental property because the landlord changes their mind around something. So
that's right.
I wonder, Saul, if we could just step back a bit and just talk about some of the really interesting demographic changes that Australian households have also experienced over the last 60 or so years, I mean, since the early 60s, in terms of how our family size and composition has changed and the impact that has had on the number of houses we need as a society, the increase in family breakdowns and what that means for the number of houses we need. Even with an ageing population, you have less people living in houses than we once did.
That's right.
I mean, I think it's incredible looking at the figures. Was it at the beginning of the 20th century, you had on average 4.5 people, which obviously wasn't possible, but that was the figure, 4.5 people living in a house, and now it's about 2. So this means we need more we think we need more houses for even more people as our population grows.
Well, that's right. There have been 3 important trends that have driven that in the post-war period, and the figures I have tell me that the average number of people per dwelling has declined from just over 4 when Menzies became Prime Minister at the end of 1940s to 2.8 in 2023 per dwelling. Now, as I say, there are 3 important social changes that have driven that. One is that nuclear families have become smaller. You know, the typical family now has 2 or fewer children, as opposed to 4 or more that was the norm in the immediate post-war period. The second thing is that more families are breaking up, unfortunately. And when a family breaks up, that means that what used to live in one house now needs 2, typically, or one house and one flat. But that has been a significant contributor to the increase in the demand for housing. The third factor has been the ageing of the population and the fact that people whose children have grown up and fled the family nest live as a couple. And then it's typically because the man dies earlier, older women living alone in houses that often in many cases too big for them and difficult to maintain, but they can't move in part because of the burden of stamp duty on changing properties. So all of those things have driven a significant decline in the number of people per dwelling. And then we had, during COVID, people went back to live in the parental home because share housing became much less desirable. Now, of course, we've got more multi-generational households than has been the norm in Australia, much more common, for example, in Asian or Italian or Greek households to have 3 generations living under one roof. But that's becoming more common now because in some ways I sort of say that instead of protesting on the streets, as baby boomers would have done when they were in their 20s and things were happening that they didn't like, today's 20 and early 30-year-olds are too busy staring at their phones to be doing that sort of thing. But they take out their revenge on their parents' generation by refusing to move out of their homes and expecting their meals cooked, their laundry washed.
So.
No. Well, I have a 22-year-old who's still at home, but And I have a 16-year-old who I will expect, in the normal course of events to be at home for at least another 5 or 6 years. But of course, it's becoming increasingly common for people still to be living in the parental home in their early 30s, if not longer. And of course, it's now more common for grandparents to move in with their adult children at some point in their lives too, maybe sometimes to take care of their grandchildren, but otherwise just as an alternative to being put into residential aged care or something like that. So this is all changing the type of housing that people want, as well as the amount of housing that they have. But there's another social dimension to that as well, which is the rise in the importance of the bank of mum and dad, which some people say is the 5th biggest lender in the country after the 4 major banks. And if it's not a lender, it's sometimes a provider of deposits, first homeowner grants for your own children sort of thing, or is a guarantor of children's mortgages. So that adds to the importance of picking your parents carefully.
Yes.
If you are to do well in life. And that's not the sort of society that Menzies envisaged, or that most Australians would have thought was how well you do in life depends on how well you've chosen your parents, rather than how well you've worked and how hard you've striven to be educated, or whether you've taken risks associated with starting a business, the sort of things that traditionally have been major ways that people have improved their stock in life.
Do you think, Saul, that this has been driven, these public policy failures that we've seen for the last 50, 60 years that have led to boosting house prices rather than boosting supply of houses, do you think that is down to just what the population wants, though? Or, surely it's not what we want, but the sort of society that Australia has grown into likes to have expensive houses and sees the home as this wealth creation vehicle? Or because it doesn't seem like it is in the Australian DNA to think that this situation is acceptable. And as you say, the policy responses have been flaming failures for decades. But
and yet we keep doing the same thing. Yeah. And yet we keep doing the same thing. Again, I apologise for sounding cynical, but I think politicians have delivered housing policies that they think the people want, irrespective of what they say. And political analysts and opinion pollsters increasingly observe that people will say one thing in response to an opinion poll and something else in the privacy of the ballot booth. And I think that's particularly true in housing. It's probably socially unacceptable for anyone to say, I want property prices to continue going up at double the rate of inflation, even if that is actually what they secretly want based on their own self-interest. And as Neville Wran used to say, in a 2-horse race, he will place back self-interest because at least it's trying. To take, for example, a policy decision that I think has contributed significantly to the escalation of house prices and to the decline in home ownership since 1999 was the halving of the capital gains tax rate in 1999. You remember that Keating introduced a capital gains tax in 1985, which taxed capital gains at a taxpayer's full marginal rate less an allowance for CPI inflation. And in 1999, that was replaced by the Howard Costello government with a regime that taxed nominal capital gains at half the marginal rate you would otherwise pay. And one of the things that did was to convert negative gearing, which had been around for a long time, but had primarily been a strategy for deferring tax, into a strategy which allowed you both to defer tax and permanently to reduce it by converting wage and salary income taxable at your marginal rate into capital gains taxable at half your marginal rate. And this change was made by the Howard Costello government in response to a recommendation from the Ralph Review of Business Taxation that was published in 1998, which recommended it and said that it would turn Australia into a nation of entrepreneurs and shareholders, which it conspicuously failed to do because the proportion of the population who are business owners has declined since then. The proportion of the population who are shareholders has declined egregiously since then, although most Australians are indirectly shareholders through their superannuation funds. But in terms of having a sense of ownership that owning shares in a company gives you, that's declined. Instead, what it's done is turn us into a nation of property speculators. Because as taxation office figures show, 20% of Australians are landlords.
It's amazing.
That's an astonishingly high percentage by international standards in most other countries, including the ones that we in Australia commonly compare ourselves with, like the US or the UK or Canada. The rental housing stock is overwhelmingly owned by some combination of government authorities, not-for-profits and charities, and companies established for the specific purpose of building, owning and managing rental housing. And of course, none of them have the vote. Whereas in Australia, the rental housing stock is overwhelmingly owned by individual investors, what politicians like to call, quote, mums and dads, unquote. And they vote. And they vote against anything that gives tenants more rights. And they vote against anything that reduces their privileged tax positions. And they vote against anything that might slow the rate at which property prices go up. Because in Australia, unlike most other countries, landlords are in it for capital gains. They're not in it for rental income, as build-to-rent companies in the United States are, or they're not in it for a noble purpose like not-for-profits and religious associations or state government authorities are. In other countries, they're in it to make a buck.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with wanting to make a buck. So generally speaking, a desirable objective, but we have fueled it by making it a vehicle for reducing tax. I'm not saying tax avoidance or tax evasion. I'm saying reducing tax because it's legal. And as I say, now 1/5 of Australians are doing it, responding rationally to the incentives which the taxation system is giving. And so now you have far more people in the Australian community who are landlords than there are people who are aspiring first home buyers. And it's no wonder, therefore, that when politicians think about what housing policies to pursue, the interests of landlords carry greater weight in what's actually done, perhaps as distinct from what's said, but carry much greater weight in what's actually done than the interests of aspiring first home buyers.
Saul, is there a way to fix this housing affordability crisis? I mean, we haven't even mentioned it, but you did note that in Menzies' day, the medium house price was 3.5 times the median income. But these days, I think it's about 7.5 times. So it's a huge uplift. Is there a way of fixing the housing affordability crisis without then cutting into people's wealth accumulation? Is it one or the other? I mean, it seems a terrible dilemma.
There is no short-term fix.
No.
There is no short-term solution to this problem at all. There are no magic bullets. When I'm asked this question, I start with the simple proposition that when you're in a hole, the first thing you've got to do is stop digging. We are in the hole that we are in, which has been getting deeper over the last 60 years, because for 60 years, governments have pursued policies that inflate demand needlessly by giving people more money to spend on housing, whilst at the same time reducing the supply of housing, or at least constraining the rate at which housing supply increases and making it more expensive to add to the stock of housing. So we've got to stop doing those things, first of all. And then I would argue, while government shouldn't do anything deliberately to deflate demand, government shouldn't go about doing things that reduce the absolute price of housing, because, number one, you can't calibrate and control that, and you might end up with the sort of thing that happened in the United States in 2008. I used to say at the time the Americans actually solved their housing affordability problem in 2008 by trashing their economy and their financial system. I'm not advocating that. No. But there is a lot that can be done on the supply side of housing. And there are examples of where that's been done. And, for example, in New Zealand, the Auckland City Council has taken some pretty dramatic steps to make it easier to build at higher densities within the city of Auckland. And house prices have risen a lot less in Auckland than they have in other parts of New Zealand since that happened, and the supply of housing in Auckland has increased quite significantly. There are things that the state governments can do with regard to their own planning powers, and with the controls that they can exercise over how local governments use their planning and zoning powers, and the way in which they charge for these things that they haven't done as much as they should have done. And the federal government has a lever here as well, because it can, under Section 96 of the Constitution, make grants to states on such terms and conditions as it thinks fit. It could make the grants it makes to states for housing that the state authorities use to provide social housing, it could make those grants conditional on the states doing more to remove roadblocks to expanding housing supply. Now, to be fair, the Turnbull and Morrison governments made some steps in that direction, and Albanese government has taken those steps further by setting explicit targets for each state to both build more social housing and to increase the supply of housing more broadly by the private sector. But they could be pushed harder to make state governments do what only state and local governments can do. I mean, the federal government can't do this directly, and the federal government could perhaps put more money into the provision of social housing, hopefully not by government workforces, as was done in the 50s and 60s, but by contracting with the private sector to build more social housing at higher densities, close to transport nodes and closer to centres of employment. But in order to do that, you have to overcome the entrenched resistance of those who already live in those areas. And, that's the problem, is that local governments, local councillors, by definition, want votes from people who live in the areas they represent. The people who would like to live in those areas don't get a vote in local council elections. So state and federal governments have to take a firm hand here, in my view, if anything is to be done on the supply side. I would also argue that replacing stamp duty with a more broadly based land tax, which every inquiry into taxation since the Asprey inquiry in the 1970s, all the way up to the Henry inquiry and then to the report that was done by former Telstra CEO David Thodey to the Berejiklian and Peritek government in New South Wales, all of them have recommended this. It's not easy because, again, reform, which every economist regards as sensible, requires state governments to shift from a tax which people pay at most 2 or 3 times during their life, but a big tax when they pay it, with a much smaller tax that they then have to pay every year. That's a hard sell politically, and you would need appropriate transitional provisions to avoid double taxation of people who've recently bought property. You can do that. It's possible to devise appropriate transitional procedures, but it requires an enormous amount of political courage, something which, like housing itself, has been in short supply in recent years.
Yeah. So when you wrote your submission, I think it was 11 years ago, you gave your suggestions on how to fix the housing crisis. And I was reading your quip at the end of your submission, which is ringing true today. You said there was less chance of any of these proposals being taken up than there is of Andrew Demetriou, who was then, of course, CEO of the AFL, calling a press conference to announce that Tasmania really should have its own team in the AFL. Well, you've got that now coming.
Well, we do, but
at
a very high price. No one asked the governments of New South Wales or Queensland to build a brand new stadium in order that they get not just 1 but 2 teams in the AFL competition. No one insisted that it have a covered roof, even though it rains an awful lot more in Sydney and Brisbane than it does in Hobart. Nobody asked the WA or South Australian governments to build new stadia, although they have of their own volition. It wasn't a condition for having West Coast Eagles or Fremantle or Port Adelaide or Adelaide in the AFL competition. Only Tasmania has been subject to these kind of demands. These days, though, I have to say that I've probably got a better chance of seeing a thylacine running across my front lawn of a morning than I have of the kind of changes to housing policy that I think need to be implemented, actually being implemented in what's left of my sentient lifetime.
Well, we'll see. Maybe in 10 years' time we can reconvene, and if genetic technology has moved as fast as the AFL's decision-making has, we might actually see that thylacine and still be waiting for housing policy fixes. I hope not, for the sake of my children and your children, though.
Indeed. Well, as they say, hope springs eternal.
It does. Well, thank you so much, Saul, for sharing your thoughts and experience on this critical issue for Australia. I think it's so useful to have this historical context as well when thinking about where we go forward as a nation. So really appreciate you joining me on Afternoon Light.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.